I was working in fermentation sciences and strain improvement, and I was hoping after my PhD I'd get a role working in fungi and sustainable materials or sustainable chemical production, and to find one that was very similar to what was another sort of aspect of what I'd been interested in, which was using mycelium as foodstuff directly, like corn did. The role came around and they were like, "Are you interested?" And I was like, "This is absolutely right down my street. There's so much that I already know so much about, but then there's this whole aspect of doing it for a food stuff that would be enough of a challenge for me that immediately going into it, I would know that I'd have to learn a lot more."
Hi everyone, we're back with another episode of the Blooming Late Scientists. I say this every episode, but we have had some amazing guests on so far. So many different stories, so many different journeys, and it's really great to hear about all these different experiences because I don't know how you feel, but I feel like in life sciences and biotech, at surface level, it feels like everyone's the same and they've all had this traditional journey into science, but it's actually not the case. And anyway, we've got like another brilliant guest today that I'm going to hand over to. And this is Dr. Paul Brett. But Paul, I'm going to hand over to you to do your little intro and talk about where you are now.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's nice to know that you're talking to other people that have had a less traditional sort of start into science. Makes me feel not quite as alone.
Exactly.
My name is Dr. Paul Brett. I started my PhD in my 30s. I'd previously been a school teacher, and circumstances kind of led me to do a master's in biotechnology and then immediately follow up with a PhD. I now work for a startup working in the food biotechnology sector, and we work in using fungal fermentation to produce alt protein meat alternatives. And we're actually trying to, like corn, use fungal fermentation to make a meat alternative. But unlike corn, we actually are trying to replicate whole cuts of meat, like a whole steak.
Ah, that's really interesting actually, because one of the companies that I follow quite a bit is Higher Steak, but I think they've just renamed.
I do remember the previous name, but I can't remember who they are right now.
I've been following them for a while, but it's really interesting, isn't it? And I know we were kind of having this conversation before I hit record, but this kind of startup environment, like what is it that you like about it so much?
I suppose there's a lot of work to be done, and at points in my PhD, I was so bogged down in the minutiae, the details of one particular question, and it could take me months and months and months. What I think I like about a startup is there's a whole range of issues that I don't mean issues in a problematic sense, but I just mean things to resolve that you're constantly adapting and changing how you look at to meet a business need. And yeah, it's very dynamic, and I'm learning a lot just to be able to kind of make things happen. Yeah, and just the independence as well, and high level science, which is a great combination, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like you say that you're learning such a huge amount, and I imagine that it's kind of, I mean, I hate using this phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway. But it's kind of like having fingers in lots of pies, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Because you literally have to do so
And
many different things.
yeah, and becoming competent to good in a particular skill, and that being sufficient. And in the same time frame, it might take me maybe a year to become an expert in one thing. Now I've got a year to become competent to good in maybe 10 different things. It's easier as we obviously grow and we'll hire more staff because people can compartmentalize somewhat, and we can have teams particularly to address particular challenges. But in the early days of working at this company, I've been able to learn a lot. I've been faced with lots of challenges and trying to make that work. But yeah, it makes me feel like I've learned a lot more breadth to the depth of my PhD.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because actually one of the other guests that I have on or had on said something quite similar, but actually said that the reason he had been able to progress his career so quickly was that he had gone from that ability you just described to be like this expert in a very, very tiny area, to understanding that actually the key to progression was not to be an expert in everything, but to learn loads of stuff and just know enough.
Yeah. And be sufficient, happy to be competent to good.
Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Which is difficult. Absolutely. It's a difficult mindset to overcome as well, because you come from academia where you think the only way that you can prove yourself is to become an absolute expert in a particular thing. Now that barely matters to most people. It's just, we need you to be able to do 10 things well enough, and you've just got to say, okay, I'll do what I need to do to get it done, and that'll be enough.
But that's going to be so important, isn't it, as you move on in the company, having all these different skill sets.
I suppose so. I suppose using my teaching background as well, if we do grow and we become a larger company, hiring people that are not so much already an expert or good in what they're doing, but show aptitude to learn, me having the confidence that I can take that person and say, look, I'm going to show you how to be competent in this. We've got it up to this point. I'd like you now to take that away, and you can grow that, and that can become your own. I'll give you the basics of what I know, but from here, I'd very much like you to be able to answer a couple of questions, and you have the time to be able to answer those. So for them, I don't know. I suppose the early days when we make early hires, and we have already hired one or two hires underneath me, those people still need to be able to multitask, do different jobs, but you can see some compartmentalization already occurring, where some people take care of X, Y, and Z, so I can focus on A, B, and Z. Yeah, I suppose in that regard, as we get larger, compartmentalization, I think, will actually occur more and more. But for me, I'll probably have to have my finger still in every pie, to borrow the expression that you used, to check that everyone is doing what they need to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, it takes a long time, doesn't it, for a company to get to the point where, hopefully there's never a point where you don't do different things, because I think so many scientists are drawn to that aspect of startups, the fact that you do all these other things. You hope that in, as you watch companies grow, that they don't become silos, and that they still kind of, there are people kind of crossing over into different areas, because I think that's really important.
Absolutely. And the ways in which the tools that you use actually develop. So as the technology increases, you need to be able to increase what you can do. I can actually give you a context within that, actually, of today. So today I've actually been at the University of Nottingham, where I did my PhD, looking at some of the microscopy, or what's called scanning electron microscopy, so I could image at the micro and nano scale, which I'd done for my PhD. So I was hoping that I would just be able to take off from there. But I spoke to a couple of the technicians there, and they've actually introduced me to a new tool that they've got a couple of them over there, called CryoFib SEM, which takes all of that I knew of SEM and the ability to image at a micro scale, but in fact allows you to now use lasers that can cut, so you can image within layers.
Oh, wow.
So if, for example, you were using something like we have, which is mycelium replicating the textures of meat, we can actually not only surface image it, but actually cut through it, so we can see how that changes through depth.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
So it gives me an opportunity to learn a bit more as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds amazing. And it sounds like it'd be so useful, in many different areas.
Oh, absolutely. I think a couple of the professors here at the university, particularly over in food sciences, one of them, Gleb Yakubov, he was actually on one of the BBC Food Unwrapped, or a show similar to that, talking about modified starches and how they modify different foodstuffs. And I actually saw a couple of the images that he'd been working on, and they're very cool, because you're actually looking through the 3 dimensions of something you think is a homogeneous structure, like a gelatin or a gel or a mayo, something like that. But now you can freeze that and then scan through those layers and just see the differences. Yeah, it looks like a very, very, very good tool to use.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. So I mean, we're going to go back at some point, but just because we're
Okay.
here now,
Yeah, sure.
when you finished your PhD and you went into this position, how did you find a position like this? Was this something that kind of came out of the back end of your PhD, or were you actively looking for something?
Yeah, I was actually looking for something exactly, well, I won't say exactly like this, but very, very similar to what I was doing. My PhD focused on mycology, which is the study of fungi.
Yes.
And I'd been using certain fungi that are used for production of chemicals that could be used as foodstuffs, in particular citric acid.
Mm,
So lots of people think that citric acid will come from lemons and we use it in food. But I think it's about 95% of all citric acid used in foodstuffs is actually produced through the fermentation of this particular mold, not from lemons. So next
I
time
didn't
you're
know
eating tang
that.
fastics, yeah, next time you're like, they've got those little crystals of, tangy tang fastics, then yeah, that's actually more likely that it's going to have come from a fermentation from this mold. So I was kind of right there. I was working in fermentation sciences and strain improvement. And I was hoping after my PhD, I'd get a role working in fungi and sustainable materials or sustainable chemical production, and to find one that was very similar to what was another sort of aspect of what I'd been interested in, which was using mycelium as foodstuff directly, like corn
Mm,
did. The role came around and they were like, "Are you interested?" And I was like, "This is absolutely right down my street. There's so much that I already know so much about, but then there's this whole aspect of doing it for a food stuff that would be enough of a challenge for me that immediately going into it, I would know that I'd have to learn a lot more." But yeah, that was kind
I
of
mean, what are the chances of
how I
that
got into it.
happening? It's quite low, isn't it? That you kind of find exactly the thing
I,
you're looking for.
yeah, I suppose when it gets to a certain level, though, like all roads point to like the six people who are probably in a position to be able to do
Mm,
this, and there's probably only about 4 or 5 labs that work in mycology adjacent to food production that aren't a startup already in
mm,
academia, and I happen to be in one of them. And actually, one of my friends from my PhD actually works for another company, and they're using fungal or fungi, because he's another fungal PhD, as a leather replacement.
oh yeah, so this is something that I'm really keen on actually. So I was in the fashion
Yeah.
industry years ago. Um, so this whole sustainable fashion, I go to loads of like conferences in London, the small ones, and
Hmm.
they often have these like designers and scientists there, this kind of collaboration between them. I think it's incredible.
Yeah, I think Stella McCartney actually did.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's a different company, by the way. It's not the one that my friend works for. But
Mm,
yeah, so I just think that there's like this groundswell of support for fungal alternatives. I'm seeing it in leather replacement, meat replacement, or using fungi as building materials. I know that there's some companies now that actually use what's called fungal fermentation, but rather than it being in a liquid, it's actually done um, in just the air. So the mycelium will actually grow into a waste product like wood chips. But more often than not, the actual majority of the product is actually the fungal mycelium, and it has some great characteristics. So it could be incredibly sound resistant or fireproof. And there are companies now using it as an alternative to foam insulation within walls, and another company that use it to manufacture um, plant pots and decorative things that once they've gone past their life, they're not plastic. They're
yeah,
compostable.
that's a great
You put them out in your
idea.
compost heap and they will break down. And there's this big groundswell. And there was a bit of edgy, strange mycologist in the US called Paul Stamets, that most people might know as one of the more famous mycologists. And I think he's kind of caught people's imagination to a degree about the various uses that fungi can have. And I think that crossing with sustainability and everyone's efforts to kind of be more sustainable, it's just like the perfect storm
Yeah.
of things that has allowed this groundswell to emerge.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we could have an entire podcast episode about this easily. Or a series,
Absolutely. Oh yeah,
because I
some very
have
very
so many
niche
questions
uses as
about
well.
scalability and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely love all this kind of mycology based stuff and sustainable materials. That's right up my street. But thinking back to so let's go back when you did your undergrad. So did you do that straight from like in the traditional way?
Yes, so did A levels at school, and then I did my undergrad immediately
So what
after.
was your undergrad?
Biochemistry.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it was in a science.
Yeah, it wasn't a science. Yeah, but I never really felt like that was the direction that I was going to go into. I suppose it having studied at undergrad, I felt like everything that I'd learned was so diverse. I wasn't aware, or I wasn't wise enough, or I was very naive. I didn't really foresee a career path coming out of that. I'd done it because I felt like I needed to do that, and I did enjoy science, but I didn't necessarily see the career at that time and where it was going to take me.
I think so many people do that, don't they? They're like, because you love the subject, or let's be honest, sometimes it's not that you love the subject, it's that it's the one you're good at if you compare it to everything else.
Yeah, and going back further than that, actually, I think that there's been a number of people I can point to and just say that person kind of molded me in just the right time. So I think when I was in year 10 and year 11, I had two teachers at exactly the right time when I might have gone off the rails a little bit. They just happened to be my maths and my science teacher, and they saw something in me and harnessed it in a way. And they might not know that that was what was happening, but it certainly did. And it molded me to become, well, they think I'm good at this. I think I'm good at this. Let's go down this road a bit. And then years and years and years later, somebody else, when I actually did the masters, and we can talk about that in a bit, I did a masters the year before I started my PhD. I actually worked with a professor, Avis Hall at the University of Hertfordshire, and she took me aside for a project. And yeah, she was very, very, she's a very strong-willed woman, and she was amazing. She was coming right towards the end of her career, and she just saw something in me as well, and she awakened something very different in me. I'd gone into the masters doing it out of curiosity, and I came out at the end of that project with her with focus and clarity and direction, and a real thing that I wanted to attack at a PhD level. And so I think she helped clarify that for me.
I mean, they do say it takes a village, right? And I think when it comes to education, it's so true. Teachers and lecturers get such a bad rap. But, I am very similar. If I think back to the key points where I got to a point where I thought, yeah, I'm going to do this now, I'm going to do something different, that was because I had someone behind me going, no, you can do this. We can, you can go in this direction and you can do it. And I just think that's so undervalued. Like people just don't realize how much that matters.
I think that's the truest sense of diversity as well. People with a diverse range of interests and the ways in which they can kind of direct. I think growing up, I grew up in a very strange family. I think, to cut a long story short, I've got 7 brothers, but they're all very
Wow.
similar, and I was very different. So I
7.
wasn't necessarily molded to be. Yeah, so there was 8 of us in total, but 3 sets of parents. So it was sort of complex, but just living with one of those sets of parents who weren't the set of parent for any one of us.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, so very, very blended family. But yeah, I wasn't, I think they were all at that stage, they were all very sportsman-like, and I really wasn't. I was very bookish, and I think I stood out as being a bit odd. And don't really felt like that sort of background really favoured me in much ways. So as soon as there were a couple of individuals that were like, it's actually okay to be how you are and to enjoy science and maths, and you can attack that with full gusto, and that's completely fine. It's just allowed the brakes to come off a bit.
I think, you know what? Thank you for sharing that, because when you're younger, being odd is considered to be like a really bad thing, isn't it? And then as you get older, you realize that those are the things that really set you apart from other people. Like it isn't odd, it's just your individuality, but it's so hard when you're younger to deal with that.
Yeah, and I think you problematize it as an individual simply because you look at the people around you. But if I'd have been sporty and all of my 7 brothers would have been bookish, then I would have felt like I was odd anyway because I was different to everybody else. So I think it's just like the people that you're around, and that's why I was saying about like true diversity of having these different people that have these different interests and just seeing who they are. Then that allows you to flourish and become the true version of yourself.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I feel like I mean, we have a lot of negative things to say about the academic environment in general, but that is one of the things I would say is a real positive about the kind of academia is that there's so much diversity. And, you know, if you come from, like I came from an area that was I came from Dagenham. I don't know if you know it.
I was going to say you sound like you're East London or Essex. Not too far from
Oh,
me.
okay. So are you familiar with the area?
Yeah, I know Essex fairly well. I'm not from Essex. I lived in South London and Hertfordshire.
Okay, nice parts. But where I was from was very much like, you know, I don't know how to, but everyone was white, and you know, it was very much just, I don't know, just so old fashioned in their views. And of course, when you grow up like that and you're surrounded by that, you don't know anything else. So for me, going to university at 30 was eye opening and completely changed my view of the world.
Oh, I had a conversation very similar to this actually with one of my friends the other day. When I went to my undergrad, I went into going into undergrad believing there were maybe about 4 or 5 private schools in the UK. It didn't compute to me that there was such a huge number of people that went to private schools, and I just thought it was the normal was just go to a public school, and then there were these exceptional people for whatever reason that went to private school. I didn't understand it. It was
everywhere.
this class divide. So I was from Hertfordshire, but it could have been St Albans, but no, I'm actually from Stevenage. So,
Okay.
has its own sort of reputation, I suppose.
Yeah. But so when you finish your undergrad, I know you said that you did it, but you kind of weren't sure what you was doing with it. What did that lead into?
I worked at a couple of jobs, just earning what I had to earn, doing what I thought I had to do. So I don't know if I spoke to you when we were recording or before. I had some smaller roles at GlaxoSmithKline in Stevenage and Johnson Matthey, which is in Royston in Hertfordshire. Neither of them necessarily felt right. They just felt like a job I was doing at the time. I don't think I necessarily knew what I wanted to do. And then, strangely, an opportunity came up where a lot of my friends that I'd made at undergrad went to Australia. And I said, okay, let's do that. So I went to Australia and I was there for about 2 years. I did a number of things that were a bit strange. Most people who go to Australia on a tourist visa, which is what I was on, will automatically get 1 year. But if you want to renew it for a second year, you have to do a period of agricultural work. And I actually worked on a banana farm for about 3 months. But I came from a biochemistry background, and now I was actually in a banana farm. And it was manual labor, but I was also working within food, and I was also working within ideas of disease within bananas, and there were fungi that are responsible for wiping out bananas in the 50s and 60s. So we had something called Panama wilt. Some interesting side story, but you know the artificial banana flavor? That's what bananas used to taste like in the 50s.
Really?
The banana that we have now, the Cavendish banana, is the one that survived this disease in the 50s or 60s called Fusarium wilt. And yeah, it survived, whereas the old banana that used to be the international banana is gone now. Got wiped
that's
out.
insane, because that artificial taste, I mean, this is not a word, but I'm going to use it.
I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but it's much more, it was developed to be aligned with that previous banana that doesn't exist anymore.
I mean, it's so much more banana-y.
Yeah,
if I
they
can
say
use
the
that as a
Cavendish
word.
banana from a taste perspective is worse.
Yeah.
It survived, so we use it, but it's a inferior flavour
Oh,
to the one
wow.
that they had before.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I had no idea.
And yeah, so bananas are a weird example of this as well. But all bananas are clonal. They don't sexually reproduce, or at least the ones that we consume. So there's like a weird genetic malfunction where they don't produce enough copies of the chromosomes necessary for sex. So what we do is we just like a herb. If you were to cut a herb and repot it, it would grow again as a new plant. Bananas have these weird side shoots called suckers, and you can pull them off, plant them somewhere else, and they grow up. But with that comes two issues. Diseases that are inhabiting the plant can then be carried. And secondly, there's no genetic diversity. So if a microbe or a pathogen were able to overcome the defenses of one of the plants, all the other plants are the same. And so it will just rip through them.
Wow, I feel like every day's a school day. I didn't know any of this.
Yeah, so there's all these other diseases that are kind of proven to be an issue for the Cavendish banana.
I mean, I can tell that this is something you're quite passionate about.
Well, it's a strange one because obviously I didn't know an awful lot about fungi at the time, but I learned some stuff about fungi when I was working on banana farms. But I also loved agriculture and the production of food. But I was never going to be a farmer. So I was like, can I work in that food space? And it wasn't until maybe a good 10 years later that something really came of that. And that was within the masters. I started working, like I said, with Avis Hall at the University of Hertfordshire. And actually, one of the first tasks she put me to was to look at emerging diseases of bananas. And I was like, oh, I might know a little bit about this. But then it developed, and we worked on a soft fruit farm together, and we were looking at pathogenic fungi and beneficial fungi that might be used in soft fruit farms, with the pathogenic ones being ones that will kill the crops or at least make them unpalatable. But there are beneficial fungi because some fungi can be used to control insects that are pests of strawberries, for example. So if there is a particular mite that grows in a greenhouse and you can treat it with a fungus that is a pathogen of that mite, it's like a secondary level of control.
It's almost like parasite, isn't it?
So we were looking at that. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if you've seen the series The Last of Us.
Nope.
Okay, well, it kind of caught the imagination. It was based off of a game where there is actually in the wild, there is a type of mushroom that infects ants and it gets into their brain, and it's called the zombie mind control fungus. I won't get into the details of that, but it's part of the sexual cycle of the mushroom itself, and it can control the ant to do what it wants. This particular show, it was about that, but it had mutated so it could infect humans.
Oh.
And again, it's just another one of those where people are coming up to me by this point and being like, Paul, can that happen? Not really.
Right, I need to watch that now. I have read so I love parasitology. My PhD was in parasitology, but Parasite Rex, actually, if you've read that book, has a bit about these kind of there's another fungus that infects wasps, I believe, which is very similar and does like this whole brain control thing. But yeah, it's fascinating. But so, sorry, when you say you worked on these soft fruit farms, were you in the UK?
Yes. And they were based in and around Cambridgeshire, Wisbeach.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So I did some lab work on sort of identifying what fungi already existed on these soft fruit farms. But one of the fruit farms, it wasn't producing fruit for production. It was a research fruit farm in Rothamsted as well in Hertfordshire. And just seeing how the populations of the fungi differed according to different characteristics. So they were having this approach where there's a particular mold that grows on strawberry but requires high humidity. The strawberries also require high humidity. One team had developed these little sensors that monitor the level of humidity around the strawberry plant at the ground level. And when it gets too high, they automatically tell the greenhouses to open up on the sides so the wind comes through, reduces the humidity, and it drops back down again. So you can collect data on the amount of time that you're at the danger level of humidity and therefore prevent the growth of these pathogenic fungi or saprotrophic fungi. But then it has a negative impact on the fungi that then would be used as control of the insects. So it becomes this huge tapestry of complexity. But yeah, I was just working on that. And believe it or not, a field called mycovirology. So viruses that inhabit fungi and whether there are beneficial characteristics that can be given to fungi through the use of different viruses. And there are some. There's a mushroom in Australia that if it's infected with a particular virus, it can survive fire or much better.
Wow.
So when you get forest fires in Australia, immediately afterwards, there's a certain type of mushroom that grows up out of the ground because it actually can do very well out of the carbon that's left behind. But it has to survive the fire in the first instance. So then it becomes more beneficial, or there's an evolutionary pressure that if you have this particular virus that allows that to occur, you're more likely to have that. And then there's ones that make them more pathogenic on insects. So a virus may infer the ability to be more pathogenic on viruses.
Wow.
I don't know an awful lot about the reasons why, but if you think about how we have transposable elements and different genes and horizontal gene transfer, all that can occur. Yeah, so it could be something along those lines.
I don't think I want to do my job anymore.
Do any parasites. What is a parasite? Could a gene be a parasite?
Well, I guess we could say anything could be, right?
Yeah, and then you get that whole conversation about P elements and transposable elements and what they mean even for our own. I saw, again, just back onto fungi, you can tell that that's what I do. I read a paper yesterday and they were looking at species delimitation. So if you've got these different strains, are they all one species? And all the different approaches that we have to try and characterize what a species is. Typically what they will use is, can they actually intersexually cross? And sometimes we can actually limit species according to the fact that they don't sexually reproduce, or we can say, well, they actually can and produce offspring, so maybe they're not two different species, they're just different morphologies of one species. And then someone realized that you can look at the genome, and there are some fungi that within one species there can be threefold as much genomic information. And the only distinction is that the one with much more genomic information, 66% of it is transposable elements. It's more transposable elements than it is its original genome.
Wow, that's insane. That's actually insane.
But they say that about us and bacteria,
Yes,
don't they? That you
more
are
bacteria.
10 times as many
But it's
bacterial
not
cells
true.
as you are human cells. Is it not? Is it just a myth?
Yes, it is a myth that has been dispelled, that myth. Yeah, only in the last couple of years, yeah. I mean, I don't know if they know the exact answer, but there was a load of research done looking at that, and there was a few articles released about how that wasn't true. Do you know what's interesting? As you're talking to me now, I hope, we can talk about this, but you were a teacher before, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can definitely tell, and what I mean by that, that's a compliment, by the way, is that you have this really great ability to communicate the scientific knowledge without it being really confusing. So let's talk about that. Like, how do you think that transferred to everything you've done since then, like everything that you gained in that teaching environment, if you're happy to talk about that?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit more complex than I'm able to break down into a few sentences, but I suppose taking the things that are interesting about science, or that at least I thought I could make into a story that could capture the imagination, and then have some science that you learn as a result. I think I can probably go as early as this. If there is this trick, right? It seems like a magic trick to lots of students. You get them to pick a number, and we can do this if you prefer.
Okay, yeah,
Get you
go
to
on.
pick a number between 1 and 10 in your head, and I also encourage the audience to do this. I imagine they'll all pick different numbers.
Okay.
Now, in your head, double that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now I'll pick a number at random from my book, add 10.
Yeah.
Now, whatever you're on, divide by 2
Yeah.
and subtract the number that you began with.
Yeah.
Now, I imagine it would be different for everyone, but you're on 5.
Yeah.
Okay.
I am on 5. How did you do that?
And what will be strange for your audience is that they'll all think, well, I started on a different number, and they all did, but they'll all end up on 5. And if you give that to a room of students and they all know that they've started in a different place, it seems like magic. But once you explain it to them, it's actually just algebra. Whatever number you give me is X. Whatever number you had in your head is X. I ask you to times it by 2, so it becomes 2X. I then ask you to plus 10, so it becomes 2X plus 10. Divide that by 2, it becomes X plus 5. And then subtract the number you began with, X. It's just 5. And no matter what you began with, it's only going to be 5.
Oh my God, that's like mind blowing. No one,
And then now
no one did this
algebra
to
isn't
me at
that
school.
boring now, because they've
No,
got this
it's
magic
actually
trick.
not.
Yeah. And so I suppose in a microcosm, finding that you have the ability to create like a trick or something that can engage people, and then want to know how or why that attaches to the subject matter. And then you can, I think me and my friend, we actually nicknamed it stealth science, where you can teach them science without them realizing you were teaching them science. And you can go through these topics, and they're so caught up with the imagination of the wealth of animals that are out there, or different plants or different fungi and what they can do. They forget that it's science, because it doesn't feel like a lesson. It feels like an explanation of a thing that caught their imagination.
I mean, as someone who's now in marketing, I can tell you that that is a skill. I mean, especially in a company like Yoring, that it's going to need to tell their story as they grow and talk about the science. That ability to communicate in that way is worth so much. Like, it's an incredible skill that so many people don't have.
I suppose, yeah. And just finding a way that you use the language that's appropriate to your audience. I think even when I was doing a PhD, I found so many people wanted to use such a high level of science, even in their communication, because it proved to them that they knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
But your audience is lost by that level of communication. So if you can simplify it, they'll take more from that. And in many ways, that proves to them that you know your subject more. You don't have to use fancy language. I think there's a quote, I don't know who it's attributed, but if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough.
Yeah, it's true, isn't it? Because, and the problem is that people think simplifying means dumbing down. And I don't like to use that term because there's no such thing really, but for the sake of this, let's use that term. But there's this idea that you'll be dumbing things down too much for whoever your audience might be. But it is possible to simplify things without doing that. It doesn't mean you're taking everything back to like being 5 years old at school. It is possible to simplify without doing that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the easiest two ways of doing that is just control of the language that you use. I mean, sometimes you need to introduce a new term, but introduce it as though it is a term, and just don't drown them with 10 or 20. Just say that there's this one that you'll need to know, so that's what this is called. And the other one is like an analogy. So if, for example, I was describing what that's like, what do you guys know? as an audience. So yeah, I find that they're dependent, whoever your audience is, and this could be a class of school children. During my PhD, I used to organise researchers talking to the University for the Third Age, which are a range of people who are retired. They're very engaged with society, but then they're learning about high level research. And it was a great tool for them because they learnt about science, but it was also a great tool for researchers because they learn this audience is different to the audiences that you talk to at the university. They don't know the language or the background science to the degree that you do. So just tell stories that highlight what we do. You don't need to explain your science to a PhD level. Tell a fun snippet from this, or this leads to that disease, and you might know someone who's got that. And I think that's a really good tool. I actually worked for I did an internship at a company called the Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy, which was about communicating to government officials, or at least getting roundtables together where you would use science to try to influence policy. So it wasn't now about a politician's political view on a topic. If you could bring together the right experts to give a wealth of data that supported a particular stance, do that instead. And I think that this was incredibly important in the post-COVID world.
Yeah.
But yeah, your audience changes again. You've got this incredibly high level functioning people, politicians. They might not be scientists, but how you talk to them is incredibly important.
Yeah. And I mean, for that, you obviously have to know exactly who your audience is. So, I mean, you've had so many different experiences. And I guess the question I want to ask, because of course people are going to be listening, like thinking, oh, it's too late for me. I'm not sure I can do that. But how would things have been different for you, do you think, had you done your PhD back then when you did your undergrad, like in the traditional way?
Yeah, I suppose it gave me the room to sort of explore what my interests were. I think if I did a PhD earlier, much like how I described my undergrad, I felt like I was doing it because I was good at it, but I didn't necessarily have the direction. By the time I had actually started my PhD, I felt very sure about what my direction would be, and my PhD was my route to get to that point. So I think it was beneficial for me, to be honest, because had I done a PhD straight out of undergrad, I could have looked back and just been like, was that just an extension of me not knowing what it was I wanted to do? Was I just doing it to make up that time? Was me doing a PhD simply because I didn't know what else I was going to do?
Yeah,
And
which
so,
happens a lot.
yeah, and I feel very confident about the route that took me to where I was, and doing a PhD a little bit later than everyone else. I feel very confident. Not to say that they shouldn't, because if they are, then great. But for me, it really compounded that I went down this route because I knew at that stage it was the absolute right thing for me to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, I was in a very similar situation. I didn't do my undergrad though until I was older. So I started at 30 and stayed and did the whole thing. But similarly, I kind of felt like I really know what I'm doing this time. Well, I mean, there were times I didn't know what I was doing, let's be honest, but I kind of knew where I wanted to go, like you. I thought, I've done all this other stuff. I'm not happy. I know I need to do this to do the next thing. So for you, I guess to try and wrap this up, because I feel like I could talk to you for hours. If what would you say to somebody that is thinking about it but thinks, well, this is just too late for me. I can't do it now.
It's certainly not too late, but have an idea of what it is you want to do and why. Don't just do it because you've got the opportunity to. Have in your mind a sort of plan of why it is you're going to be doing it and what it is you want to get out from it. Don't think of a PhD in and on its own as being like a door to success. I think someone once said that you kind of get out of it what you put into it, and you're going to put a lot more into it if you have an idea of where you want to go going into the whole process.
Yeah, it's almost like that thing, isn't it? Know your why.
That's a
And
book,
then
isn't it?
is it a book?
I think it's a book. Yeah.
So I've stolen it then.
There you go.
I thought it was mine.
Oh no,
Yeah.
Start With Why is what I was.
Start With Why. Is that Simon Sinek?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't read it, but I do see his books everywhere, especially on LinkedIn. They love a quote like that. I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I think that people are going to get so much out of hearing you and listening to your journey, but also just listening to your passion about mycology. I think people are going to love that. So yes, really appreciate you taking the time. And I just want to say thank you to everyone else for listening again for another week of the Blooming Late Scientists. And we'll be back next week with another guest. Thanks, everyone.